Okay, so thank you everyone for joining us here in the room and for all of you online. My name is Danette Veal and I'll be monitoring the Twitter feed today. So for any questions for our panelists, please submit them to pound VES11D and they will be taking questions throughout the event, so don't hold back. We have a very great panel lined up here to speak about digital event technology for business engagement, the scope of solutions, and the best applications. We have Paul Salinger, VP of Events at Oracle. We have Randy Choco over on the far end, Group Manager for Digital Events at Microsoft. And in the middle, we have Steve Gogolak, Director, Media and Webcasting at Kramer. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to the guys. Thanks.
Thanks. So I'll kick it off and I'll sort of say we were looking at trying to figure out how to address this particular topic, and the scope of solutions that's available is fairly well represented over in the exhibit hall, and so we decided that we were putting together an outline trying to figure out what to do, and said rather than go through a very organized presentation showing you everything that you can learn by walking 20 feet over, why don't we instead pick the questions that we get asked the most often. And so what we've done is each of us has two questions that we get asked frequently, and it will cover the scope of solutions, because in the answers we basically have what we've defined in particular case studies and things like that. So it will cover a lot of the different technologies that are available. So the questions that we have, we'll just go through the 6 questions quickly. The first one, which I think it will be relevant to many of you, I want to dabble in a virtual event. I'm not ready to commit the budget to a full-blown event. What should I do to get started while still ensuring a successful event? The second, what sort of event is not right for a virtual event? What should I be avoiding? Or am I trying to push virtual technology on something that's not quite right? Third, I have a physical event, but it only happens once a year. Should I use a virtual event to bridge the gap? We've heard a lot about that today, so I have an interesting case study to go through on that question. How are virtual events and hybrid events transforming from events into marketing communication environments? So this is the perpetual environment conversation, and we'll address that. One of the things that we're doing here today, which is a simultaneous approach to both virtual and physical. We've got 2 audiences that we need to address. We have all of you in the room and then those of you online, and talking about some of the pitfalls that exist there, and things that you can do to make sure that both audiences stay engaged. And then are there things that physical audiences can do to interact with virtual participants? So that's the full scope. I'll go through, and what I'll say is that if at any point anyone has any questions, or if there are relevant questions online, please feel free to put your hand up and interrupt. We won't necessarily do a Q&A session at the end, so we'll just kind of keep it fluid. All right. So the first one is the dabble question. This is a difficult topic to address, and so this is sort of some approach that I will offer as a means to try to figure out like what your dabbling actually means. The first thing that I'll say is that the experience matters the most, and so that's the thing that needs to be defined. And we've heard a lot about experience or engagement, and sort of how do you actually go about defining it. So I want to talk a little bit about how I approach that. But some of the questions that you really want to ask yourself to figure out what experience is right is, what's the purpose of the event? What am I trying to do with this? Why is someone interested in attending? What's the key takeaway for the audience? And then also, what's the resulting action that they're actually going to do as a result of attending this particular event online? So that's something that maybe the whole purpose of it is just to create an interesting experience, but then what's the point of that? What are they going to buy something? Are you trying to set up a meeting? Is there a follow-up that's happening? And really that particular piece of information is kind of what defines the technology that you're going to want to actually use, because that's the piece of measurement that has to be facilitated. The other thing is, in terms of the spend that you have, there are a lot of ways to think about this, and you could say, well, I have an aggregated budget and this is just sort of what I've decided I have to spend on this. Another way to think of it that is a lot more effective is figuring out what your budget is based on the value of each individual attendee. And sometimes thinking about it this way, you say, okay, well, I have 500 people that I expect to attend. How much is each of those people worth to me? Or how much is each of those people worth to my sponsors who are going to be in the booth? Are they worth $10? Are they worth $50? What type of sell am I making to these people? And because one particular person could constitute a deal that's worth several $100,000 or $1 million, and so maybe that person is an extremely high value person. You don't need that many conversions off this event in order to pay for it. So those are the kinds of things you want to figure out in terms of dabbling. From an experience point of view, this is just a very simple way of representing the quick, what are the steps along the path for that particular attendee that they're actually going to take inside of your event. And this is the most important thing, and I would say from the standpoint, there was a little bit of talk of RFPs and that sort of thing. If you've done this already, at least in outline format, it's better than any RFP you can write, because this is defining what you want the attendee to actually go through and what you want to do. And in essence, you're also saying each one of these steps along the way is also a measurement point that you can then draw data off of. So figuring this out is not that difficult, because we've all kind of done the virtual event experience in some way, and if you haven't, you should go and just try to figure out what that consists of. But it's basically, there's some communication that's outbound, then you're clicking on some link, there's a registration process, there's typically a virtual host that introduces the event, there is an opening webcast or maybe a series of webcasts, then there are chat rooms and all these things, and figuring out what's the path that you're trying to define for that attendee along the way, and understanding what the calls to action are from each specific point. How are you getting people from the webcast into the chat room? Why do they want to go there? Because there's a topic that's relevant to some thing that was covered inside of the webcast, and trying to tie all of those things through specifically. And this doesn't take very long. You can sit down for an hour and you can define out like a pretty good event experience that will serve you well in terms of creating the event. Anyway, so to conclude the first question, the keys for the dabblers, I think the cost structure for virtual events and for webcasting or for any sort of online collaborative tool or online event tool is pretty complicated. And so if you're setting out the first thing to understand what the cost structure is, that can paralyze you a lot. And I think you're probably better served to figure out what's the experience that I want to create first, and then going in and saying, this is the experience that I think is going to meet my objective. Now what do I actually need in order to do that based on the value of this attendee to me? So define the duration of your event, the number of audience segments that you're dealing with. That will help you determine the volume of content that you need to actually create for it. And then another big factor is, am I going to do this as an audio only experience, or am I going to incorporate video, and how much video and what quality of video? So those are some of the pieces that are in there that will help you get to the point where you can say, okay, now I understand how to get started. All right.
So I'm going to tackle what sort of event is not right for virtual only. And actually, if you go to the next slide, I really kind of looked at it from a more positive approach, which is what is right for a virtual event, a virtual only event. Hopefully we can all make that mental leap. I think we're all reasonably intelligent people. So the first thing I would like to encourage you to do, and I think this has been said before, and that's to really think holistically about this. We've all attended here in person a lot of sessions on virtual events. If you're watching online, you've watched a lot of sessions on virtual events. We're going to go back to our offices. We're all going to be hopped up on virtual events, right? We're going to be the proverbial person that has a hammer and everything looks like a nail. So I would just challenge you to really step back and think holistically and logically about your event mix, first of all, of in-person, hybrid, and virtual, and your entire marketing mix, and make sure that what you're doing makes sense and you're doing it for the right reasons, not just to do virtual only. We do a lot of virtual only events at Microsoft that don't have an in-person component to them. And these are sort of some of the things we'll look at when we're deciding whether something is right for a virtual event. First of all is of course your audience, and really only you know how receptive your audiences would be to an in-person only event. We've done in-person only events for C-level audiences, and they've worked reasonably well. But certainly our technical audiences, our developer audiences are much more likely to embrace a virtual only event. You know, they're comfortable with the technology, they're comfortable sitting in front of a computer all day and learning that way. They may be in a role where they can't travel to a lot of different events anyway, so virtual only makes a lot of sense for them. Steve touched on this, the marketing objective and your attendee engagement. You know, really, some things aren't going to work for a virtual event, a virtual only event. You could get a bunch of executives online on Xbox Online or like Xbox Live to play golf, but it's not going to be the same as sending them to Pebble Beach, right? I mean, sometimes you need that handshake, that face-to-face interaction. Maybe you have a complicated physical product that needs to really be demonstrated, and doing it on video or doing it online just doesn't make sense. So, I mean, we all know, there's a lot of us in the room right here, we all know these face-to-face interactions still do count, and they count quite a bit. So think about really what you're trying to accomplish there. Timely and timeless. One of the great things about virtual only is it can be, don't let any of my stakeholders hear this, but it can be spun up rather quickly if you need to. Occasionally we need to get out important technical information to our audience, and it's possible in a day to spin up a virtual only webcast that we certainly obviously couldn't do in person. It would just take too long, and we can create a real engaging experience for customers very, very, very quickly compared to a hybrid event or a physical event. And then one of the great values of a virtual only event is they're timeless. The content stays there. It has a great shelf life. So that sort of plays into the mix of whether you want to use virtual only. Continuity is another issue, and I heard somebody mention this yesterday. I can't remember what session. I went to 5 sessions yesterday and going to 5 today. If you're watching online, you're watching a lot of these sessions in order. The reason we're doing that, it's probably not the best way to consume information, but it doesn't make sense for me to fly down to Las Vegas every other day or once a week to get these piecemeal. In a virtual only environment, of course, you can do that. And we did something, took a page from the television show 24, and we did a series called 24 Hours of Exchange. It sounds really exciting, doesn't it? 24 hours of exchange. So we had 24-hour-long virtual-only segments on Exchange server, and obviously no one's going to show up and sit in some room for 24 hours to watch that, or maybe even over a few days. It'd be tough to do. We showed one a week for 24 weeks. It was extremely popular, something that we could continue to engage our audience with over time, and it led to a great learning experience, and it could only be done virtually. And then Steve touched on budget. I won't really go into that in any more detail. I put that at the very bottom. You hate to make a virtual-only decision based on your available budget, but I mean, we are all dealing with budget realities, and sometimes that might play into it. Go to the next slide. Just a couple quick examples. At Microsoft, we do a lot of live technical webcasts. There's probably 3 or 4 going on this morning. As we're speaking. They're great virtual-only medium. It's relatively low cost. We've kind of got it down to an art right now where we can spin them up pretty quickly and pretty cost-effectively. They're highly scalable. Our customers love them. They can be anywhere from 15 minutes long up to 90 minutes long if the technical content is good enough, and our customers will stick with it. It's great for them. They're convenient. And then they're available on demand afterwards. Something else we've started up this past year is a hands-on lab online program where we've created these virtual environments where attendees can come online and try the products without having to download and install the bits on their own computers or configure a lab to do that. Again, it's a virtual-only experience. It's a guided experience with a proctor available to answer questions, and it's been a great boon for us as well. 2 virtual-only events that have really made sense for us.
Okay.
So, any questions so far about anything we're talking about?
All right. So the next question, I have a physical event, but it only happens once a year. Should I use a virtual event to bridge the gap? There's been a bunch of different sort of takes and opinions and approaches on this. What I wanted to do is I want to offer one specific case study for you that is a really interesting approach in terms of how do I actually drive interest in a physical event with a virtual event. And this involves, there are a number of different tools that are in here. So we did a program for Sage North America that has a customer conference that's in the summertime, and they basically said we have a long dark period following our event, and we don't necessarily think that that's a good thing for our customers because they're not necessarily hearing from us until we start to market the next event. And this is on the event side of things as opposed to on the individual product side. So how can we basically communicate with them throughout that dark period and solicit feedback, and at the same time we want to gather information so that it's actually going to support the content and the messaging that's going on at that live physical event. So what we did is we put a program together for them. There was a marketing campaign that drove into this event The goal was to get 500 customers into the event. We ended up exceeding that. We got a little over 700 that were in there. But what made this program very interesting is, as I sort of alluded to that engagement map before, we had a very, very tight experience. That everything took place in 2 hours. So this isn't like this long multi-day like big event where there was all kinds of things going on. Yes, there were a lot of offshoots and a lot of conversations that came out of that, but there was a very detailed program for a specific period of time. These shots show at the beginning, part of the marketing campaign was producing a video at the beginning that showed the benefits of attending. And while there were some incentives in terms of iPad giveaways and some flip camera giveaways and things like that, really the incentive was the fact that they were going to get exposure, all the customers were going to get exposure to product managers within the company and have direct access to ask them questions. And conceptually what we were doing is we were telling the product managers, tell us what you want to present, and we're going to let the audience react to that. And so we gave them a 90-second spot inside of individual webcasts within their product category. And we shipped flip cameras out to them, and it was very interesting to see the content that came back. But essentially, the visitors came in. We had professional host talent also that acted as the MC of the event. So that particular MC was seen as part of the email campaign. He was seen as the virtual host that said, here's the environment, here's how to get around, this is who I am, this is what's going to happen. And all of this was supported in the emails and marketing material that had gone up. The agenda for the event was very well spelled out. So following this, there was an opening session. The host basically introduced the Sage North America's CEO, who gave an address for 5 minutes, and then it was followed up by two mid-level executives that were doing analysis on the CEO's address. And so you can get the sense here that this isn't just sort of a talking head. This is a programmatic approach that looks like a television show. And the idea is that we have one host that's carrying this entire conversation forward. The key in here also was that no segment was actually longer than about 6 or 7 minutes long. So every 6 or 7 minutes, we were having a new piece of programming that was hitting this audience, that was keeping them interested, and we were changing it up. So it was never just this long monologue of a presentation. And it's a very specific type of event that this worked for. The technical content, obviously, you can keep people around longer for. I think we've heard that before. Right. Along the way, we're measuring how people are doing and whether or not they're staying on track or whether they're falling off the path and they're doing other things within the environment. But all of that measurement then was taken to support messaging for that physical event. And so we came through, and the host made a specific call to action, said, okay, what's going to happen next is you're going to hear a rapid-fire series of presentations. And you're going to be able to vote after every single one of the presentations. And we used the automatic polling feature so that we actually put in the video screen, click here to vote now. The poll came up automatically. It asked the question, what do you think of this session? And so we had 125 individual pitches that went through in about a 20-minute period. So you picked your product category and you heard anywhere from 2 to 10 or so. And the amount of data that came back in that 20-minute period is enough to keep people busy for about a month of analysis. So this is a very interesting opportunity to say, how can we use the data that we're gathering off of a virtual event to support a physical event? And we're in the process now of creating that messaging platform for the executives, and then the individual product managers are using that information to determine which topic should I speak on in my particular product area, what's going to be of interest. At the same time, all of those customers are saying, hey, isn't this great? I heard from the individual product managers. I got to see their face. I know who they are now. I got to ask them questions that then get followed up on individually. So all of this is like generating this sort of level of interest and connection between the company and its customers that's kind of subliminal. I mean, that was something that we knew was going to happen, but we were like, well, it's just a fact of the way that we're executing this. And we've already heard feedback that supports it that's anecdotal. There isn't necessarily a perfect way to measure that other than sort of some aggregate surveys. So that was the plan, and then every single one of these sessions drove into the forums that had pre-populated topics of interest. So we heard in the keynote that it's very important to seed questions that are in there. So there were actually moderators that were inside of each one of the forums that had posted 3 questions, and then we're driving the conversation through for about a 20 to 25 minute period following the opening and then the voting period. So there actually ended up being an enormous amount of forum activity, and all of this is conversations that can then be read through in this thread format to understand what are people interested in and what are they talking about. And so while we're gathering the data off of the polling, we're also gathering individual data that can then be followed up on, because we know who actually submitted every single one of the polling responses. We know who was speaking inside of the forum. So if someone had an interesting idea, the product managers were following up with them directly to blow that out and say, okay, maybe we can build a session around this idea. Following that, a bunch of the partners that were brought in for the particular live conference were also given an opportunity to showcase themselves inside of this event. There was a lot of feedback. The best piece of feedback that we got was that there was one customer, one partner that was able to close a cross-sell deal like 2 days after this as a result of someone visiting their booth. And so again, I mean, we have the aggregate data that says this is how long people stayed here and this is what happened, but we're actually getting some of the feedback now that says it, not only that, but it created a connection that then led to some actual business development. So that's that particular case study. And if anyone has questions on that, we can answer them here. I can answer them afterwards as well.
So I'm going to take a slightly different approach to what Steve and Randy have been talking about, because they've done a good job of covering, sort of the very event level virtual or hybrid approach here, and some of the things that you should think about. Where I think that this is evolving to some degree, and what we're starting to think about, because in reality, an event or even a series of events is just one part of a marketing mix. It's one part of an integrated marketing campaign. And for us, actually, could you go back to your experience map?
Yep.
Because I actually want to kind of talk to that from a sort of different perspective. So if you think about this experience map, not from a single event perspective, but from an integrated marketing campaign perspective, then you start to look at this in terms of how you actually drive people to different interactions and different pieces of marketing through kind of a funnel. Because really what we're trying to do is, we're certainly wanting to aggregate the data from an event, but then we want to use that data to actually drive them to the next piece of marketing that we want to do for them. Because what we want to do is eventually drive them into a sales pipeline, because at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is generate revenue. And while it's certainly important to aggregate all the data from a particular event, what we're trying to do is take that data and think about what's the sequence of activities that we want to do with a customer to drive them into the sales pipeline. So for example, here you might look at this from an experience map in the same sense of like mapping this out from a campaign perspective and thinking about, okay, if we do a virtual event, or if we do a webcast, or if we do a hybrid event, whatever it might be, and to me the platform is, somewhat irrelevant. It's based on, what you're trying to do with that particular audience. And then think about, okay, once that moment in time happens, then where are we taking them next? What analysis are we doing out of that event? Where are we taking them next? And even then along the way, as you're doing that campaign, there may be transactional opportunities. So if an attendee went to a webcast about a particular product and submitted, say, a question, online or something, is that a transactional opportunity to drive them to an immediate sale? And if not, can we then take them back into our funnel and move them to the next set of activities, which might again include another virtual event or another webcast, or a piece of, direct marketing, though we don't do a lot of direct marketing these days, but some other piece of marketing activity. And then I think what we're seeing is that, you can then take that event environment. Let's say you're doing a hybrid event where you've got a physical event, and maybe it's a webcast of a small live event, a seminar or something like that. What we're doing is taking that and actually building alongside of it what we're calling like these virtual briefing centers, for example, where maybe from that event we then want to drive them into kind of a virtual briefing center, which is that sort of 365-day a year where we can put other pieces of content that are relevant to the event that they attended, and again, keep driving them along sort of a chain of activities. So that's how I think, I think this is somewhat evolving into kind of like getting out of the mindset of like, okay, I'm going to do a virtual event as a standalone kind of thing, or even a hybrid event as a standalone kind of thing, because if you're in the B2B space as I am and as Randy are, again, what you're trying to do is you're trying to drive not only just leads, but real opportunities and a real sales pipeline that leads to, generating revenue for the company. Because, our little motto is sort of, when the cash register rings, marketing wins. So that's one way to think about this. And so it's thinking about this from an integrated marketing campaign perspective, where you've got an event as a piece of that, and then you're building alongside of it other campaign assets like virtual briefing centers or other pieces of collateral. And then even within those events and within those virtual briefing centers, you can keep tying back to relevant pieces of content. If somebody within a virtual event, for example, exhibited interest in a sponsor booth, for example, if you have a booth environment, can you then create a sponsor opportunity by passing that lead back to the sponsor, letting them engage, and scheduling chats, and keeping that line of communication open so that you're creating these conversations, and it's not just, an event attendee, it's actually building a relationship and continuing a conversation throughout the marketing funnel and into the sales pipeline. So that's kind of the way that we're thinking about this. And if you want to kind of go ahead, I don't have a great example, from a perspective of that, what I was just talking about. But if you look at something like this, so this was actually a virtual event. It was a launch of a program for a partner community. And so what we did with this particular one was to build that virtual community, but then alongside of it there was another whole marketing campaign that kept attendees involved, and this is now generated into an ongoing marketing campaign for our partners around what we're doing with this particular product for them. And there's not really a lot to say. It's sort of your typical virtual event environment. And much like what Randy was talking about, there was kind of a hosted television set, and there was some engagement about what some of the content was, and it was just really well received. And we ran this over a 24-hour period for partners around the world, because we didn't want them to have to travel, and it was a cost-effective way of reaching a bunch of people at one time. Those numbers might look low in terms of 736 attendees, but that was actually the target for this particular program. So again, it's not necessarily about big, massive amounts of numbers. It's about actual targets and whether you're reaching those actual targets, and then again, driving them into the next set of activities. Any questions on that question, or anything coming in from the virtual audience? Hello to the virtual audience, by the way. So why don't we go to the next question?
Well, I was going to say, I think the thing that's interesting about what you're saying is the experience map, for this, it's part of like a nested series of those experience maps inside of the larger marketing campaign. And I think that's like the concept is like thinking of it that way. And what I think is the hardest part is getting to the next step.
Right. And I think you're right. And I think the interesting thing that, it's a bit of a conversation between your event marketing people and your kind of marketing campaign people in terms of, okay, if we've got this kind of environment, whether it be a virtual environment or if we're just doing a hybrid event that's a webcast with some social media integration, what should that other marketing asset start to look like? Can we start to create a marketing environment, if you will, using some of these virtual technologies, whether it be a virtual briefing center or, again, taking that physical event that has been, attached to a hybrid kind of thing and driving to another virtual kind of thing. It's that integration that I think is important.
Mm-hmm. I think the thing that's most interesting about the virtual event concept is that you have the opportunity to play your story out the way you would want to tell it if you had someone kind of chained to their chair. That's the biggest thing is like we're always constantly sort of competing with the idea we have to make this elevator pitch and it has to be really short, and then the user's going to choose which direction that they want to go. That's sort of the paradigm of the web is people click on whatever they want and they hit the back button and you have no ability to control that whatsoever. So the point is that when you get into a virtual platform, yes, people still have the opportunity to go around. It's not necessarily a forced linear path, but at the same time, you have a much better way to tell your story. And you have these sort of these steps along the way to guide people through that experience. And so planning that experience out is much more important, because every single opportunity where there's a gap, you're like, I have to get someone from this webcast to this chat session. Well, that's an opportunity for them to go 9 other places or leave. So what's the call to action that's coming out of that webcast? How specific is it? How tightly is that topic tied to the next activity? And getting people to move, and then you're making the decision easier for them, even though you still don't control it.
Yeah.
And we don't have that opportunity on a web page.
Yeah, I think the other important part, and Randy can jump in here too anytime, but the other important part is to really think about how you're going to use that analytical data. We're fortunate, obviously, at Oracle. We're a big company. We've got people on staff who do all that analytical work, and they're really looking at very carefully trying to establish even some personal profiles of some of these people and doing real interesting data mining, so that again, as we move them through the funnel, we know when to drive them into a transaction, as opposed to when marketing should take back over and keep driving them into the funnel.
And one of the other things we've found, not everything we're doing is driving into the funnel. We certainly do a lot of sales-oriented virtual events, but we also do a lot of events that are strictly there for our customer and partner experience. Microsoft measures every year how our customers and our partners think about Microsoft, and then we try to track that back to what activities are driving the positive responses. And one of the things we found is some of these virtual events are among the biggest impactors of when people answer the question, how I think of Microsoft. A lot of it is these webcasts and these holos, these hands-on labs, and of course our in-person events as well.
Yeah.
All
and
right.
You could sort of blow through these. I'm not going to talk to these really. Well, I'm going to talk to that one, but sort of as an answer to this question. Do you want me to take this one, or were you going to take this one?
I think this is mine.
That's yours. Okay,
yours?
go for it.
You can answer it when I'm done. There's a simultaneous approach to virtual physical work with your audience, a split between virtual and physical, like today. So anyone want to guess what my answer might be on that? My answer would be yes. If you don't realize that, I don't think you've been paying attention, because it can work, and it has worked really well. If you want to go to the next slide, I can kind of show you some things that we've done with some simulcasts recently, and these are not the big simulcasts. We're trying to get to a point where we can take even relatively small local regional events and simulcast those out much more broadly. And we found that we can extend the reach at a relatively low cost. There's technologies out there where you can do this for almost nothing. I think we heard about some of those.
It's interesting
today.
that you're saying incremental reach here, because I think that we've actually found that on demand actually gets far broader reach than a live webcast.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And if you jump down to the numbers at the bottom, you can see that, right? We had 60 in person, which normally we'd call a great event, and that'd be it. Online, we had 900 people watching this single event, and then we've gotten 1,400 so far on demand, and it just keeps on giving, right? It's the gift that keeps on giving at almost no cost. One of the things I just want to touch on real quickly here, if you didn't attend the social networking session this morning, I'd encourage you to go back and watch it on demand, because there was some great information. Touched on exactly what we found, which is that there's this huge opportunity for online engagement. I think we used to think that when you had an in-person event that we all get to talk to each other between the sessions and after the session. It's this great engagement capability, and online you don't get any of that, and that's totally not true. We're finding. It's like the people that always tend to sit right behind me at the movie theater and talk about the movie the whole time it's going on. So as we're in here, and no one's doing that, and thank you very much for not doing that, but there's this whole group online that is doing that, and they're getting a completely different experience than people here in the room are. There's sort of this crowdsourcing, knowledge sharing that's going on out on Twitter in this case, that is really adding to that discussion. I see a few people maybe with iPads and laptops open that are participating in that, but it's just a great way to engage. And I watched on this particular event, this Windows Phone event, we had in this case, it was a managed chat. It wasn't Twitter. But we had 300 people participating in that. We had dedicated subject matter experts that were actually online answering questions. They were as knowledgeable as the speakers, so they were really deeply engaging with this community, and it was just fascinating to watch the interaction online. I think, again, it was probably a better experience than some of the people in the room may have been getting.
Yeah, no, it's true, and I mean, we've done sort of similar kinds of things where we ran an event at our conference center where, you know, we can hold 400 people, you know, and it happened to be with our CEO, and it was during one of our acquisitions. But we actually had a Twitter back channel going and was a moderated chat, much as you're describing, but there was so much activity there that it actually became the #1 trending topic in the San Francisco Bay Area, which happened to be the same day that Apple was doing an event and announcing the iPad. So it was interesting that at one point we were actually the #1 trending topic just because the channel and the engagement that we had going there.
Yeah, it can be really, really strong.
The one thing that I'll say too on this particular topic is understanding which audience to use as your primary audience, and I think that one always wins. You know, that's the thing. I think the one thing about this event in particular is that we as speakers, everyone organizing the event, there's still a pretty strong focus on the people that actually attend physically, and some of that has to do with the way that the content is prepared or the way that the presentations are prepared, and also the fact that there are 9 virtual event platforms that are doing this, so you've got 9 different experiences online in addition to the one that's in the room. But it's important to consider that. I mean, with these numbers that Randy's shown here, you can tell that numbers-wise, the people that are in the room are not the most important group because they're the small. I mean, well, maybe they are the most important, but they're not the largest group. So there's a consideration there for, okay, I'm extending my reach significantly, but what am I doing to cater to the people who are online? Just because they're not in front of me and they can't come up to me and complain about something or have a suggestion or contribute as much as the people in person, does that make that right, basically?
It's a really great point, Stephen. We were just talking about this recently, that we almost need to kind of take a step back and start to think about our events, if we're doing these kind of hybrid events, as, you know, television shows first and live events second, because you have so much opportunity with that, you know, broader reach of an online audience, that if you're not designing for their maximum experience, you're really losing something in terms of the amount of engagement that you can have with them. And if you start from the perspective of, okay, you know, much like you were talking about with your 6 to 7 minute segments, if you start thinking about how to design this as a television show for the attention span of the 1,000 people that might be online versus the 60 people that are in the room, you can still give a great experience to the people in the room, much like, you know, television does for live audiences. But you can also give a great experience, you know, instead of just like a secondary audience to your online audience.
I call it the fly on the wall effect. That basically right now, if you're online, everybody feels like flies on the wall because they're watching something happen. They're not necessarily part of it. Now there are a lot of things that are happening online that we can't participate in, so that they're out there. Everyone's talking on Twitter and having conversations and you know, asking questions and doing things like that. And so there's sort of a different thing that's happening outside of it. But for the most part, the reason that this works as a hybrid event is because something's actually happening. So I've heard a lot of people saying, well, if you're doing an event, just take all of that content and put it into a virtual event platform and that'll work. Well, not necessarily, because this experience was designed for people who are in the room.
Right.
And that if you just put that online, it doesn't work because it then, in an on-demand fashion, it doesn't have that storytelling that you need in order to capture someone's attention and actually get them to motivate them to make some type of decision.
And it would be interesting to hear from the online audience, you know, that's been attending throughout this thing, you know, not only what their experience has been, but what do they think that this could have looked like if it had been designed, you know, as a televised event, for example. How would that have changed the content? How would that have changed the interaction between the live audience and the virtual audience?
Any questions so far? Everybody knows everything, which is great.
There's a question.
Oh.
We do a lot of hybrid and online-only multi-day events, and when we do the managed chat areas, we find that it starts getting unwieldy after like 300 people. Have you found that as well? And if so, do you start like breaking them out into different topic groups so they can have a really good synchronous conversation? You know, around that 100 it starts
So that's a great lead into this question that we're going to talk about.
Sure.
Can you repeat the question?
So, managing chat sessions that are getting too large or becoming unwieldy, what can you do from a technology perspective to help manage the volume of people? So, is this one yours?
I think this was mine. I think this is one of the interesting questions is that, we've often looked at, these hybrid events as, again, kind of a split. You've got a virtual audience and you've got a live audience. And, one of the learning things that we're trying to accomplish in some of these conferences is, how can we collaborate better? And so if you're going to plan an event that has both a physical and a virtual, how can you start to think about, that learning engagement? How can you set up some things around collaboration, for example? So there's a couple of things that we're trying and that I've seen some other people try that I think are kind of interesting to think about. One is if you have a physical audience and you have a virtual audience, you might think about setting it up to where the virtual audience is also in kind of pods of live audiences, and then see if there's some technology where you can bring those virtual audiences into your live event in some way. Pretty simple technology actually with cameras and whatnot, and think about, is there a way that you can set up some collaborative things that both the virtual and the physical audience can do. So for example, you might have a panel discussion like this going on in one location. You might have a simultaneous panel discussion going on in a second location. You might then link those two things together and have a cross collaboration in terms of what did you guys talk about, what did you guys talk about, what are the takeaways from each of those different things. The other thing I think that's important in terms of interaction between what's happening live and virtual participants is to kind of take into account what you're doing sort of geographically. If you want to jump back to one of my slides on, that one, on this idea of social webcasts. So this was actually, again, another partner event that we did where we had I guess you would call it a live event. It was essentially a webcast. It was, a panel of people in a studio. But they had a moderator off to the side, and they did this again over a 24-hour period where each region kind of had the same content. But what they did that was good from the physical versus virtual audience and trying to bring the two together in some interesting way was when they got to certain segments within each region, the host, who happened to be our Senior Vice President of Alliances, would actually bring in remotely a local language person. And then that local language person would become kind of the voice of that region and talk in local language so that there's some communication between the live and the virtual audience. And they did that for each region. So, I mean, that's sort of another way to think about how to kind of combine what you're doing live with what you're doing remote, is like bringing in some local language, bringing in some local flavor. So, anything you want to add to that one?
The only thing I'd say to sort of get to answer the chat volume question directly. I mean, really, right now, regardless of what platform you're on, there's sort of two methods of handling interaction. There's the synchronous method, which is chat, and there's asynchronous, which is forums. So deciding which one of those two is most appropriate for the conversation is probably the first thing to figure out. And sometimes, if you get to a point where you're going to have a chat where the topic isn't specific enough that it might break off and you kind of want a threaded approach, a forum may be more appropriate. And then what you're looking for is a forum technology that will allow real-time updates, basically. So rather than having people having to refresh the page or constantly go through that, you're going to get something. So we use the Unisphere platform for the Sage virtual event, and as part of those forum sessions, the forums do update in real time. So as people post that, they come in automatically. There is no page refresh or anything that's going on.
Which I think is actually another opportunity for the live audience and the virtual audience to connect, is through those forums. So it's kind of taking this idea that they did at PCMA where you have almost like a pop-up breakout. So you've got a session going on, there's a bunch of people kind of talking online, maybe they're live, maybe they're virtual, and they're having kind of almost a conversation about what's happening. They could decide as a group hey, let's go into the forum group together and continue this conversation between what's happening there live and what we think is happening virtually, and kind of create a pop-up breakout that becomes additional content.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'd like to see most of all is on the chat side of things, sometimes you can't anticipate the topics that are going to be discussed, and so you can't like dynamically create chat rooms or allow users to dynamically create them, but that would be great if you could. So the idea would be, I think, if anyone's out there and wants to go build a product, you have a particular chat room, but then you allow the users to essentially tag individual conversations. And I mean, you take that best practice from Twitter, like hashtags didn't exist, no one invented that particular product. People said, I need a way to filter the noise, and so they started this, and then it just kind of took off in terms of the way that we use hashtags. It's the same thing inside of a chat platform. If you say, okay, this person asked an interesting question, I'm going to answer it, and someone else responds, and then everyone starts automatically tagging, and you could basically do a filter right inside of one chat room. I mean, I think that's something that still isn't quite there yet. At least I haven't seen a product that does that, whether it's inside or outside of a platform.
Maybe Donnie does, because he's with Sonic Foundry. What's your question?
Well, I actually have a question. We have a lot of meetings.
Can we give him the microphone?
We have a lot of meeting planners who've never done anything virtual before, and when they come to us to, use a webcasting platform, engagement is the biggest thing they're so afraid of. The online audience is not going to be engaged. And when you have 60 people in a room, but you have 1,400...
Or maybe they're going to be too engaged and say bad things about you.
Or too engaged in the wrong activity. You don't necessarily want people chatting throughout the course of a presentation, but
what do you guys consider successful engagement of an online audience with your physical people? I mean, what's that measure that you say this was a successful event where we engaged the online audience? I mean, of those 1,400 people or 100 people, how many people are actually having an active voice virtually with the physical people?
I think it depends on the event and what the content of that particular event is. I mean, I think I've certainly seen different varieties of engagement. I talked about the one where we became the #1 trending topic. There was a ton of engagement. Where we've been successful, and we talked about this earlier, I mean, where we've been the most successful is when, we have a very targeted audience with really relevant content, and we have moderators who are experts in that topic who are engaging the online audience, whether they be in the room live and participating, or whether they be remote and providing some engagement. And out of that comes other conversations. Sometimes we see that they will schedule a meeting or schedule another chat or something like that. That's where we've seen good opportunities, is having experts in what you're talking about moderate what's going on, so that they can be the engaging point between the virtual audience and the live audience.
I think in terms of measure too, I mean, some of the virtual platforms have done a pretty good job of twisting the language around and saying, okay, we're taking the lead scoring and we're actually going to now translate that into this is a level of engagement that's created, and that's a measurement for like the online audience. In terms of mixing it, because of the fact that there isn't a standardized technology that you can use, like an audience response system that you could use in the room that's like de facto integrated with a virtual platform or something like that. There are some of those bridges that exist, but it's mostly a polling opportunity. Right now, the biggest thing is, I think, if you use Twitter, and then you could come up with your own sort of performance indicators off of that sort of says, okay, I'm going to take my Twitter list based on the fact that I know who's attending my event. I can figure out, of the people that were posting to this hashtag, what percentage of them were actually physically attending versus were virtually attending, and you could just require that people provide their Twitter name or something like that as part of the registration process. I think that's almost viable at this point. Most people have Twitter names, but something like that, I think it kind of needs to be created. There isn't sort of one thing that we can just say, okay, this event had an engagement factor of 9. It'd be nice if you could, but I don't know how you would ever be able to do that without hooking up like some type of heart rate monitor to people and like figuring out how excited they were throughout the event.
A lot of it is qualitative, not quantitative. I mean, the great thing is you can read these comments and you can get a real instant pulse of what people were thinking of of the session, probably far greater than you're going to get from a simple questionnaire, typical questionnaire. So yeah, we can measure 30% of the people engaged in the activity in the chat. But we also looked at the things they were saying and the comments they were asking and the information they were getting, and we deemed it a success just based on the conversation that we could read in real time.
But Steve's right. I mean, even as much data as these virtual events gather, this is the sort of the hard part, is how much are people actually really engaged. And as Randy said, you can follow the stream and you can see, who's sort of paying attention, who's, retweeting things, who's commenting on things that were said. But then you've got to kind of aggregate that and figure out how you're going to actually use that data. I agree that there's not really a great way of measuring engagement per se.
I think the best way that you can measure engagement is to determine how successful was I at achieving whatever the objective is of the after event decision.
Right.
And that's the sort of thing you say, was the event effective? We've done a little bit of work with Todd Hansen at the ROI of engagement about talking about how do you measure engagement, and it's not an easy thing to do because you kind of have to take these surveys, pre-event, during event, post-event, and try to figure that out and see how people are absorbing the content and understanding, and whether or not that result leads to business action and those sorts of things. Mm-hmm. It can take months in order to figure out that if you want to measure engagement at that level. But right now you could sort of say, okay, well, I want to make sure that a certain percentage of the people are active in a chat discussion, or a certain percentage are active in a forum post, or a certain percentage are active on Twitter, and those are reasonable ways to determine engagement, but it's not really meaningful engagement unless there's some type of action you can measure afterwards.
I think we're kind of running out of time too. So.
Yeah, I think we got
So probably
5 minutes
last
here.
question then. This is a direct message that got sent over to me.
Oh,
They
great.
want to understand what your guys' take on how mobile can start to bridge some of these gaps as well.
That's another whole hour session.
My take on mobile is that mobile has a huge application in the physical event space, especially now that the majority of people that are attending events like this are fairly well connected and have smartphones. So the only thing is that putting a virtual experience on a mobile phone is a little silly. I could see sitting on the couch and doing that with your iPad or something like that, and that's really just a technical hurdle of saying, well, that the iPad doesn't support Flash. But I think from an engagement standpoint, in terms of if you're on your phone and you're able to interact with the things that we're doing by submitting your own questions in the same way that the virtual audience, and then there's sort of one repository that those questions are coming into, or one set of polling data that's going out, or if you're checking into an event through a mobile app or through a mobile website, so that you can say, well, I'm in the room, but I checked into this event on the online platform, then it starts to get kind of interesting. Now, that's not the full experience. I think some of what we heard yesterday on the panels were exploring mobile, but I don't see a reason. Are you going to be on a train or somewhere where you only have your phone, where you absolutely have to attend this event and you need to get the video and the slides and the Q&A and all that stuff? I don't necessarily think so. I think it's going to have far more application in a hybrid experience like this.
Yeah, I would tend to agree that I think that there are certainly opportunities, and I've talked to a couple of the vendors, and I think they're starting to think about how to bring some of this into a mobile environment. But I agree that your experience is going to certainly be very different on a mobile environment than it is in a computer environment. Yeah. But there are some opportunities with mobile, and I think that if we can kind of get out of the mindset of this is a virtual event or this is a particular event, is can we deliver something to a mobile user that might then at least drive them to another piece of marketing or another piece of information that might be relevant to them. So rather than trying to think about using mobile as a platform for a virtual environment, let's think about how do we take what we're doing in the virtual environment and drive relevant content into the mobile experience.
Yeah. And we're looking at ways and working with vendors to try to figure out ways to use mobile in maybe a not just extending this out like you're watching it on your laptop, but maybe using the proximity capabilities in mobile to download information from booths right when you're standing in front of the booth, or that gives you an offer as you're passing by a vendor booth on the floor, those kind of activities. There's a long way to go.
A long ways to go, but a lot of opportunities.
I think it just needs to be justified by that experience that you're trying to create.
Yeah.
Because a lot of this is we're creating features for the sake of having something interesting to do, and it's not necessarily because it's meeting some particular objective. So I think that what's going to make sense for mobile is if there's very specific activities that you can do that are part of the presentation or like part of the overall experience that's contributing to the value of attending the event. That's interesting. Simply being able to attend on a mobile phone is not necessarily as interesting because it's not as specific.
Yeah.
So I think we're kind of out of time, unless there's any last questions.
And we'll stick around afterwards.
Yeah, we'll be up here. I have a couple of handouts too for anyone that's interested. There are a couple of sort of key engagement points that things that we learned from some of the events that we've run in the past that are some good tips if anyone's wondering that. And I have handouts if you'd like to take them home.
And are those handouts available for the virtual audience?
You know what? It's funny. I was thinking about this earlier, and I was going to say thank you for reminding me. You find me on Twitter, and I will make sure that that I email you a link to the exact PDFs that I have printed. And maybe what I'll do is I'll find a way to get it into one or two of the 9 event platforms that are out there for the on-demand audience.
There you go. Well, thank you all very much.
Thank you.